Well, the impulse to act, to do something immediate and effective to alleviate suffering and stop conflict, drives many who are concerned about human rights and injustice. But this impulse can easily be turned into a call for military intervention. Before 2003, American and British political figures repeatedly spoke of a, quote, responsibility to act to stop the abuses in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Legal scholars and advocates of external military intervention during humanitarian crises now speak of the responsibility to protect as an emerging norm within international law. But humanitarian interventions from Somalia to Kosovo to Iraq have gone disastrously wrong, with dire consequences for the populations who are meant to be protected.
Our next guest has been a humanitarian aid worker in over a dozen conflict zones, including Kosovo, Afghanistan, northern Uganda. His latest book traces the development of the doctrine of humanitarian intervention and how it's been used to justify the use of force by powerful states. It's called The Thin Blue Line: How Humanitarianism Went to War. Conor Foley joins us here in the Firehouse studio. Welcome to Democracy Now! How is it used? How is humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention used?
I think over the last 10 years, there's been a move towards, as you say, a militarization of humanitarian interventions, and in two quite different ways. Firstly, I think there will be cases where the only way in which you can stop suffering, in which you can save people's lives, is through military intervention. And we see UN-authorized peacekeeping missions in probably about 20 countries at the moment. The biggest one is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But at the same time, particularly, as you said, in the run-up to Iraq, George Bush and Tony Blair have been using humanitarian arguments to justify regime change on human rights grounds. About 10 years ago, Tony Blair came to the United States and made a speech where he outlined this new doctrine and where he said it was no longer necessary to have UN authorization to invade another country. This was the time of the Kosovo conflict. And since then, there's been a huge crisis for us as humanitarian aid workers, because we work often in conflict zones alongside troops, but we're also increasingly being identified as part of occupation forces. And certainly in Afghanistan, where I've spent much of a couple of years working, we've become increasingly seen as part of that occupation force.
Talk more about Afghanistan.
I went to Afghanistan after 9/11 and set up a legal aid program there for returning refugees. When we first arrived, we were seen as neutral. We operated quite easily and openly. I mean, I used to walk to work every day. But then over 2003, 2004, the impact of Iraq, the impact of the torture in Abu Ghraib, and we became increasingly targeted by the Taliban. Several of my friends and colleagues were murdered. And as the war has escalated, the attempts, particularly by the Bush administration, to integrate aid into counterinsurgency operations has, I think, meant that we have sacrificed our neutrality. And just as happened in Iraq, we've been seen to be part of an occupation force. And that's been a terrible tragedy in human terms, obviously. Several friends and colleagues are now dead. But also for the people of Afghanistan, when we can no longer get access to the areas where we're needed. And because we object to being seen as a militarized force, we've had to restrict our movements, restrict our work, and it means we're not doing our jobs properly anymore.
Well, this urge to occupy countries for humanitarian reasons obviously is not new. I mean, I can think back to the Spanish-American War, when the American public was whipped up into a frenzy over the supposed atrocities of the Spanish government against the people of Cuba to justify the U.S. Occupation war with Spain. Could you talk about the impact, especially in the last 40 or 50 years, of the mass media, especially television, the idea that these pictures now of what is occurring in these various countries now come to England, to the United States, to Australia, and the public therefore feels a much closer sort of relationship to what's going on there?
Yeah, the CNN factor. I think you're right. There is a long history to governments using the doctrine of humanitarianism in order to invade other countries. I mean, Hitler said it when he dismembered Czechoslovakia. He went into the Sudetenland was part of to stop the persecution of people there. I think modern-day humanitarianism really dates back to the end of the first Gulf War. If you remember, after Saddam Hussein's forces were defeated and expelled from Kuwait, the Kurds in the north rose up and the Republican Guard were turned on them. And the UN Security Council passed a resolution demanding humanitarian access. And because of the CNN factor, I mean, people could see that the Iraqi armed forces had been easily beaten. They could also see that they were turning on the Kurds. They could tell that Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against the Kurds only 3 years before. So there's the real prospect of another genocide. There was 2 million Kurds fled to the border with Turkey. The Turkish forces closed the border, and there was about 1,000 people dying every day. And so there was a demand for intervention, and the UN Security Council authorised an intervention force. So really, I think that was the first time that there had been humanitarian intervention of that sort authorised by the United Nations. And as I said, there are now maybe 20 UN-authorised peacekeeping forces around the world. I think the problem really has been the manipulation of that doctrine, particularly over Iraq, and the decision by some Western powers, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, to say we will be the judge, jury and executioner when it comes to humanitarian interventions. We'll decide. We have a responsibility to act, and we'll exercise that even if the UN doesn't act itself. And at the same time, we've seen that the governments of both Britain and the United States acted illegally over Iraq, and the government of the United States clearly acted illegally in its conduct of the war on terror. So there's an element of double standards there. They're saying we're going to intervene to uphold democracy and protect human rights, yet at the same time, in our national interest, we'll disregard human rights, we'll disregard international law, and we'll disregard the laws of our own country.
What about a place like Darfur? Obviously, there's a huge movement here in this country and others calling for the Western powers to act to prevent the killings there.
I was talking last night to some people who've just come from Darfur, and I think most people on the ground, most aid workers on the ground, have been very uneasy about what's happened in Darfur over the last 4 or 5 years. Clearly there's a humanitarian crisis. Clearly tens of thousands of people have lost their lives. Clearly there is a case that the Sudanese government has implemented a policy of genocide. The Sudanese president is now indicted for genocide by the International Criminal Court. Yet there's also clearly part of the neoconservative agenda to at least threaten military force against Darfur, which isn't supported by the aid workers. I mean, aid workers have released statements saying, if you were to start unilateral military action without UN authorization, we would have to leave. We could no longer take care of the people in the camps if the Western forces intervened. Currently, there are millions of people who are completely dependent on humanitarian aid to stay alive. If you introduce force at this point, firstly, there's a question of whether or not it's credible with the US and the UK bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq. But secondly, even the threats of armed force are making it very difficult for humanitarian organisations to do their job. And I think there's been problems. I mean, this happened in Kosovo, where I was working. Clearly, there was a humanitarian crisis simmering in Kosovo, but the decision by NATO to start bombing turned what was a fairly low-level crisis that hundreds of people have been killed into a massive crisis where thousands of people were killed and hundreds of thousands of people were driven from their homes. So I think there's a dilemma in Darfur, and the aid workers are concerned about that dilemma. Yes, we want international attention in the Darfur region, but most people think that Western military intervention would be counterproductive.